Hi everyone, welcome back to GroundedHaven Homestead. Today Erin and I are going to be working out in the vegetable garden and direct sowing some things. We're going to be sowing mostly a lot of beans, but now is also a good time to be direct sowing things like cucumber and squash. So I'll show you some of the seeds that we're planting today. Alright, so here's a quick look at the seeds that I've pulled out. We have some rattlesnake pole beans, which will need to be on a trellis. And then I have a few varieties of bush beans. So I have Blue Lake, Dragon Tongue, Contender bush beans, and purple TP bush beans. So basically for beans, you just have to know if it's a bush bean or a pole bean, because pole beans will need to be trellised, but bush beans you can just grow anywhere in ground or in a container or raised bed, anything like that. So those are all like the typical green beans. I also have a couple of specialty beans. So here's a new one that I'm trying this year. These are soybeans, which I'm going to be growing for fresh eating as like edamame. I'm not trying to dry them or do anything like that. So we're gonna try these out. And you're supposed to just grow these like regular green beans. So I'm gonna plant these in one of our raised beds. We also have a couple of Asian long beans. And both of these varieties will need to be trellised. So we have a green yard-long bean as well as a red one. These varieties are super productive. We always end up with more than we can eat. So this year we're going to kind of cut back a little bit, and these are going to be growing along one of our cattle panel trellises. Now is also a good time to be sowing more radishes. We already have some in the garden that are almost ready to harvest, but we can just throw more of these in as another succession crop, and you can also do the same thing with carrots as well, although we're probably not going to be doing that today. Borage is another one that you can direct sow, and they do better direct sown because they do have tap roots that don't like to be transplanted. So those are all the things that we're going to be planting today. All of these things you can plant 1 to 2 weeks after your last frost date. So last night I think we might have had our last frost. It didn't get super cold, but it may have like just hit 32 degrees. So I'm really happy that I waited to plant stuff out. Last night we moved all of our starts indoors because usually we just leave them in the greenhouse if it's going to be warm out. But yesterday I didn't want to take the risk, and we moved everything indoors so that they could stay safe. You know, there is still a chance that we might have another frost. I mean, there's really no way to be sure of that, but I'm willing to take the risk for these things just because I haven't had a lot of investment put into them by starting them indoors. The worst thing that can happen is that they'll die and I can just direct sow them again, and we're only losing like a couple of weeks worth of time, and I haven't had to take care of these seedlings either. But if yesterday really was our last frost, then I can get these things in the ground sooner, and hopefully we can get some vegetables developing sooner from these plants. So for me, the trade-off is worth it. It's not worth it if I had been starting these plants like 4 to 6 weeks before today and was taking care of them inside. I wouldn't want to risk it for plants that I've put a lot into, but for things that I'm just throwing out into the soil, I'm just going to take that risk. So for my peppers and tomatoes, I am still waiting for a couple of weeks to plant those out. I'm going to look at the 10-day forecast in 2 weeks, and if there are no lows in the 30s, then maybe we'll plant those out. So along with the beans that I've showed you, you can also direct sow things like cucumbers and zucchini. I'm not going to be doing it today just because I did start all of mine in pots, which I did in a recent video, so I'll link that down below if you haven't watched it yet. But almost my whole tray has germinated now. I think it's been almost a week since I've sowed these, so they don't take very long at all to get going, and I'm just gonna wait until they all have maybe like one set of true leaves, and then they're going to get planted out. I definitely don't want them to become root bound in these pots because that can stunt their growth, so I want to get them out pretty soon, but we'll wait maybe another week for these. So I have all of my summer and winter squash here, lots of cucumbers, and we're just waiting on these melons to come up right now. But if you haven't started these indoors and it's after your last frost, then you might want to just direct sow some of these things. Alright, so I think the plan for today is we're going to plant up a couple of levels of our green stalk with green beans. I think that'll be a really nice thing to grow in there. And then on this side, we'll plant pole beans on this trellis. On the left here, on this cattle panel, on one side, we're going to do the Asian long beans. In our back in-ground garden over here, I think I have maybe like half a bed that we can do more bush beans in, but we'll see if we have space for that. If not, we can always plant those later in the season. We'll just do succession sowings because beans do grow pretty quickly. And then also this little area of this raised bed, we're going to be doing the edamame. So we're going to start first at this green stalk. In the top 2 tiers, we have strawberries. So the 2 tiers underneath those is where we're going to do our beans. I had some greens here, but those have been harvested. And I also have some kale that doesn't really look like it's doing anything, so I think we'll just cut that off. Just to add a little bit of nutrients back in here, we're going to do like a handful of compost into each of these pockets. Other than that, I'm not going to be doing any fertilizer. Beans don't really need it because they fix their own nitrogen, so I think just the compost is going to be enough. So we're going to do 1 tier of contender bush beans and then 1 tier of purple teepee bush beans in these. So these are the 2 tiers that I'm using, this one and this one. You can see that they're actually different sizes because I got the green stalk that had 3 tiers of the leaf and 3 tiers of the original. So this one's a little deeper, but I think both of these really are going to be fine for 1 bean plant each because beans don't get super large and their root systems are not too crazy. So that's what we're going to do now. We just have to add in a little bit of compost before we put in our seeds. I think the beans are going to be a nice thing to grow in the green stalk because when beans are producing, you kind of have to pick them like every day, and it's a lot of bending down if you have them in a raised bed or a container. So having them in kind of this like elevated container, I think is going to make it a lot easier when it comes time to harvesting. It's going to be easier on our backs, and hopefully it's going to make it easier to find all of the beans as well when we're picking. We're aiming for just 1 plant per pocket, so we're just going to do 2 seeds in each of them, so hopefully at least one of those seeds will germinate. So each of these tiers has 6 pockets. We're going to do 5 of them with beans, and then I have these nasturtiums that I started in paper pots, so you can see those roots are starting to grow through. So we're just going to do 1 of those in each of these tiers, just to add a little bit of color and for the pollinators. This one's looking really nice though. Okay. Yeah, 1 seed per. You can do 2 just to make sure they come up. Yeah. In this bed, we're going to be planting the edamame. We have a couple of things here. This is a Brussels sprouts plant, but it's not really doing anything, so we're going to cut that out. We also have this kale plant that has just kind of like started growing again for the spring, but we have kale everywhere else in the garden. So we're just going to pull this out, and then we're going to feed both of these to the chickens.
It's a maze.
Oh my gosh, when they fling it.
Yeah, I know. One of the piggies is really
So silly.
pretty growing.
We're just doing a really quick prep on this bed, just getting rid of any remaining little seedlings or weeds that are in here. And then we're going to add a really thin layer of compost. I don't think that the beans really need a lot of nutrients, but this bed hasn't been amended, so we're just going to add a little bit in here, and then after the beans are harvested, depending on what goes afterwards, this one amending will be enough for the season, or if it's something that's a really heavy feeder, we might go in with another light layer of compost. Here are the soybeans that we're going to be planting. I thought it was really cool that the dried beans are actually black. I've only ever seen soybeans where they are like a creamy beige color. So I thought that that was really different, and I'm curious to see what these look like if we eat them fresh. So just finished planting. We tried to space them about 6 inches apart. I noticed here, this is where I had a dahlia last year, and a lot of my dahlias I didn't dig up. Technically, they are not supposed to make it in our zone because they overwinter in zone 8 and above, and we're zone 7, but it does look like it overwintered just fine and it's coming back. So that's really nice to see, because anything that I don't have to start or dig up in the fall and replant is a nice bonus. And these were really beautiful in this space last year, so I'm happy to see that. Next, we're going to be planting our Asian long beans along the base of this cattle panel. In this area, we have shallots and onions, so we're going to be planting on the other side of this. And I think we'll just do like 3 or 4 of each variety. We'll do like 3 green and 3 red. We have this sorrel that is a perennial here, so maybe that will just be like the dividing point for us. The long beans can get pretty tall, so by the end of the season, they will grow up all along this cattle panel trellis and even start to grow onto the other side. But we are also going to grow a few things on the other side of the panel so that both sides will be completely utilized. I think we're going to be doing maybe a jacuzzi gourd there or something else that gets really big. We're going to be amending this section of the bed the same way as we did in the soybean bed. We're just adding a thin layer of compost, and then we're going to try and space these beans 4 to 6 inches apart. When you're growing pole beans or beans that need a trellis, you can space them pretty close together because they mostly grow vertically and they don't need a lot of space between each other. So that is definitely a benefit if you are short on space. You can grow pole beans instead of bush beans. Now we've moved on to another trellis area where we're going to be doing more vertical beans. These are going to be for the rattlesnake pole beans. So we're just doing the same thing, amending the soil very lightly, and then we are going to space these beans again 4 to 6 inches apart. We've grown these rattlesnake pole beans for a few years now, and they are super productive. You really will get a lot of beans out of just a few plants, and they produce over a very long period of time. Pole beans tend to produce over a longer period compared to bush beans, where you'll get a lot of the crop at the same time. So that's another thing to keep in mind if you're trying to decide whether to grow pole beans or bush beans. In this bed, we have a pretty good amount of space in front of where we're planting the pole beans up next to the trellis. So here we're going to also do a line of radishes on each side to use up that little bit of space that's in front of the beans. I think this is the last bed we're going to plant up today with our beans. So this bed eventually is going to be our sweet potato bed, but I think we have enough space in here that we can do 2 lines of beans on the very edges, and then later on when our sweet potato slips are ready, we'll just plant them in the middle, and that way the beans will kind of just grow while those sweet potatoes are getting established. In this bed, we're going to do 1 full row of the Blue Lake bush beans, and then on the other side, we're going to do a full row of the Dragon Tongue bush beans. I'm also going to pop in some borage seeds at the very end. If you've never grown borage before, you definitely have to grow them because the bees absolutely love them. It makes for a really nice plant. They have these pretty blue flowers and these kind of like fuzzy rounded leaves. The flowers are also edible, although we don't usually eat them, we just leave them for the bees. I'm planting a lot of beans today, and the reason that I plant so many different kinds of beans is that even within one group of vegetables, different varieties will mature at different times. So between the 4 or 5 varieties of green beans that I'm growing, they're all going to mature maybe like a week or 2 apart, and that way that kind of like prolongs our season, and it's kind of like a built-in succession sowing without us having to go in every 2 weeks to plant more beans. It's also really fun to just have all of the different different colors and varieties of beans, of course. And beans are also one of my favorite things to preserve for the winter. I usually just blanch and freeze them, and it's a really quick and easy way to preserve them. And you don't need any special equipment to do that either, like a canner if you are not into canning or are a little bit intimidated by it. And it's something that we go through a lot of in the winter. Last year, I preserved a dozen quarts of frozen green beans, and they were still probably like the first thing that we went through and ran out of during the winter. While we're out here, I figured we would just transplant a few things in the garden as well. I have some celery that we're going to transplant, and then Aaron is planting an artichoke seedling here right now. Artichokes for us are perennials, but this is my first time growing them, so we'll see how it does. But the seedlings are looking really nice and healthy. And these two things, if we do get a little bit of like a late frost or cold weather, they'll be perfectly fine with colder temperatures, so I'm not worried about that. So Aaron's planting the last artichoke at the end of this bed. This is our onion bed, which is the very last bed in the back. And here's a look at the onions and the radishes, which are doing really well right now. The radishes are bulbing up and the onions are looking really good. The only thing with this bed is that our chickens did get out one day a couple of weeks ago, and they were like scratching around in this area when the onions were still really young. So you can see we have some onions here. And then in this area, it's just kind of empty from where they were scratching. Luckily, they didn't get too far before we found them. So it's really just like a small area right here. So I figured we're gonna transplant the celery in here because I only have a few of those. So we'll be able to use up this space. There aren't that many leaves on the celery. They're still pretty small, but you can see those roots. They are pretty nice and established. Celery just takes a really long time to grow and get larger, but they're looking really nice. Alright, so I think that's going to be it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed spending some time in the garden and planting with us, and we'll see you again in the next video.
Well, do you want me to move it in a little bit, or run for the...
Oh no.
I assessed the situation to make sure you weren't going to get hurt, like if you fell or anything, and then I left. At first I was like, oh no.
I've tripped so many times. I think we have to take some of them down. Maybe like the inside one.